and asked him to take this case. There's nobody else. Now I imagine there were some friends of James. There were some people in the community. Hey, James, we got your back. Way back. You know, we'll be over here on the corner watching what goes on, and if it goes bad, we'll see what we can do to help you out, man. But for all purposes, he's alone. So imagine this. James Otis Jr., February 1761, is standing outside the courthouse, getting ready to walk in. Now you have to know what's going through his mind. Because you see, he's been charged with treason. He knows that. And he walks in those doors. At that moment, it's quite possible the whole thing is over. Because as soon as he walks in the doors, they could throw him in shackles and then hang him the next day. There'd be no trial, and then everything that he did would be nothing. Nobody would know anything about it. He would just be that crazy radical hanging in the town square. A message to any other crazy radicals who thought they might want to stand up. Gotta know this. Can you imagine what he must be feeling as he's standing at that door? But James Otis Jr. would make this statement. It's so dark I can't see my book. I can sincerely declare that I cheerfully submit myself to every odious name for conscience sake. And from my soul, I despise all those whose guilt, malice, or folly have made them my foes. He said, look, I admit that there are people out there who are wicked and evil, and that's why they're doing this. I understand that there are people who are out there breaking the law, and that's why they don't want to comply. But I also understand that there's another segment of the population that are just ignorant and they don't know any better. But at this point in time, when we're looking at through the lens of liberty, all those people are my foes. Because they're not supporting the liberty that needs to be supported. And he says, let consequences be what they will. I am determined to proceed. See, that's what sacred honor means, right? Willing to do what's right because it's right, regardless of the consequences, whether it's politically advantageous or financially gainful or even could cost your life. You're going to say, look, God gave me these rights. I'm going to stand for them, and I am going to trust that God will be with me, whatever those consequences may be. Can you imagine if Daniel had not refused the law? Can you imagine if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had said, we'll just go ahead and bow? Because sometimes saying I will not comply is exactly what God wants us to do. But here's the crazy thing. James Otis Jr. is standing before those doors all alone. And when he walks inside that courtroom, he finds something completely unexpected. Because you see, when he walks in, he's not alone. That courtroom is packed out. Now, I'm sure there was a good portion of those people who just had some morbid curiosity, right? This Otis guy, this is his last chance. We're going to go up there. He's going to walk in the door. We're going to get to see him thrown into jail. The king's going to make a message. They're going to make an example out of him. And then we'll be in town to watch him hang. We'll get like twofer. Or maybe it was a group of people, perhaps both. People throughout the colonies, like you and me, who thought, this is wrong. I want to see if somebody else thinks it's wrong too. Otis says it's wrong. Let's go see what happens. But nonetheless, that courtroom was packed out, and James Otis Jr. would argue for 5 solid hours. He would call these writs of assistance the worst instruments of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty ever found in an English law book, these warrantless searches. And after the conclusion of the arguments in 5 hours, the court didn't even give him the courtesy of an opinion. They said, we'll take it under advisement. Because they weren't dumb. They saw the crowd in that courtroom, and they knew the position of the king. And if they were to rule in favor of the king, contrary to their constitution, all those people would have their heads. But if they were to rule in favor of Otis and the people, the king would have their heads. So they said, we'll just take it under advisement. Now the interesting thing is, it's sort of a cop-out, because what happens is when a court takes something under advisement, that law stays enacted until it's changed, which means nothing changed about these writs of assistance, and everything that James Otis Jr. was lost because nothing changed. Except everything changed. The whole world changed. Because one man said, let consequences be as they will. I am determined to proceed. You see, John Adams would write about that day 40 years later, because he was in that audience. Okay. John Adams would write about that day 40 years later because he was in that audience. And he said, but Otis was a flame of fire, with a promptitude of classical allusions, a depth of research, a rapid summary of historical events and dates, a profusion of legal authorities, a prophetic glare of his eyes into the future, and a rapid torrent of impetuous eloquence. He hurried away all before him. And then Adams said of James Otis Jr. in February of 1761, American independence was then and there born. The seeds of patriots and heroes to defend the vigorous youth were then and there sown. He said every man of an immense crowded audience appeared to go away, as I did, ready to take up arms against these writs of assistance. Adams says, then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition against the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there, speaking of James Otis Jr. in February 1761, then and there, the child of independence was born. Adams would conclude by saying in 15 years, namely in 1776, that child grew up to manhood and declared himself free. When writing about James Otis Jr., our founders would call him the midwife to liberty. Because one man decided to take a stand and said, I will stand, let consequences be as they may. I will stand alone, or I will stand with you all, but nonetheless, I will stand. The entire world changed. Because you see, here's the lesson to be learned. What difference does one man make? You can never know. Because you never know who's watching. See, that courtroom wasn't just anybody. That was John Adams. That was Sam Adams. That was Dr. James Warren. Full of men and women who would be our independence. Dr. James Warren would leave that courtroom so supercharged, and Samuel Adams would get together with Dr. James Warren, and they would start the committees of correspondence. These committees that would be built throughout the colonies to educate each other on the very thing that James Otis Jr. was trying to educate on. Their Constitution, their liberty charters, their rights as Englishmen, and how the government was violating that. And from the committees of correspondence birthed the Sons of Liberty. And from the Sons of Liberty we get the Boston Tea Party. And we get the women under the leadership of Penelope Barker leading the women in their protests. Funny. The women got together in Edenton, North Carolina, under the leadership of Penelope Barker, and they signed a pledge. We, the aforesaid ladies, will purchase no English-made goods until the laws that have enslaved our people are repealed. See, they called that mandated purchasing slavery. We just allowed Justice Roberts to call it a tax. And then they made this comment. We are signing our names to a document, not hiding ourselves behind costumes like the men in Boston did at their tea party. The British will know who we are. See, you're feminists who want to rewrite history so that we can blame the men who wrote the Constitution for all the oppression against the women, want us to think that the women of that era were weak and oppressed and had no influence whatsoever on our independence and the establishment of American liberty. And that is an insidious lie. Because those women were quite often, sorry guys, braver and more resolved towards liberty than they ever were. General Cornwallis was confronted by one of his soldiers well into the Revolution. Cornwallis was on the British side, and the soldier said to him, "You know, sir, we might do well to eliminate all these rebel men, but what are we going to do? We'll still have the American women to deal with." Because that's how strong they were and how important they were. And it all started with James Otis Jr. The